RealAg Live.
Hey, Kara Oosterhuis here with RealAgriculture.com. It is Thursday. It is, I mean, I don't know where you guys are at. I know I have a coworker in Regina and it is snowing there, but I'm in southern Alberta and it is a sunny, beautiful day. I am ready to get the golf clubs out and get going. So it's Thursday. We are almost there. But I have here with me today, I'm excited for today's guest. I am going to bring him in here. His name is Mike Hilhorst, and he is a Grow Team Advisor with FCL. How's it going today?
Great, Kara. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So you're based up in Wetaskiwin, Alberta. So you're a little bit of a different, for those of you that don't know, it's central Alberta. Is that what you'd consider Wetaskiwin?
Yeah, about an hour southeast of Edmonton.
Yeah. So he's in more of a wet territory, which is a good reminder for. I know we often blanket the prairies, say we're all dry, but there is some very wet areas of the prairies as well. What sorts of? I know you do some farming yourself up there. What was 2020 like for you?
Well, 2020 was pretty rough for a lot of north central Alberta. Probably excessive rains and hailstorms and everything else. It seemed really hampered the crop. We actually seen probably some of the worst crops in recent memory. To be totally honest with you, it was pretty tough. So subsoil moisture is pretty good. It is a little dry on top. We've had a bit of an early start here in March and early April, but over the last weekend we've had some snowfalls and whatnot. And to be honest with you, it could snow here till May long weekend. So I'm not counting out Mother Nature to give us some more white stuff yet.
Yeah, I feel like you could be in the Palliser Triangle where you get no rain ever, and somehow May long weekend it always snows. So we got that there. So we're into a new season, hoping for some better things this year. What are you telling producers right now before they're getting into the field when it comes to canola agronomy?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of aspects to think about. Obviously looking at fall pricing right now, canola is looking pretty lucrative. So everybody's still pretty excited and keeping it in their rotations for sure. Some of the things that we're talking about at retail or with producers right now are just for instance, looking at 1,000 kernel weights of our canola seed. Most, if not all, manufacturers now have 1,000 kernel weights posted on their certified seed tags, and you need to look at that. I mean, some guys say, "Well, I seed 5 pounds an acre every year," but the trouble with that is, we've seen 1,000 kernel weight ranges anywhere from 3 to 7, or maybe even higher than that. So if you seed that, if you go back to your standard 5 pound seeding rate, the 3 gram 1,000 kernel weight stand is going to be pretty light right off the get-go, and potentially the 7,000 kernel weight stand might be way thicker than maybe you want. So that's one of the first considerations that we talk about is the seed itself, targeting for that 5 to 8 plants per square foot, and really knowing your land. I mean, when we think about targeting plant stands, you have to factor in mortality, and that can vary widely, anywhere from 30 to 50%, depending on the area and the year and everything else. And it's important to pay attention to those things over the years and kind of figure out your mortality for your own farm as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you want to touch a bit on why it's important to actually have that? I mean, if you don't have the right seeding rate, you're hooped all year. What do you want to talk about why it's important to get that even emergence?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a stand that's, let's just say, for instance, that you seeded quite early, say in our country, last week, April, early May, and, you seeded at 1,000 kernel weight, that 3 gram 1,000 kernel weight at 5 pounds an acre, which is, probably, pretty light. And, at the end of the day, we can see if we see emergence issues and whatnot, it can really hamper the stand. And when flea beetles and potentially deep seeding come into play, I mean, we can really see some tough stands out there. So whether you're seeding a little on the heavy side or the late or the light side, it's really important to to factor in your mortality and make sure that you're seeding at the proper rate for your field and your variety, things like that.
Now, for producers that are in some of the drier areas of the prairies, do you want to touch on how deep can you be actually seeding that canola seed? Because lots of times we want to chase the moisture, but there's such a thing as chasing it too far.
Yeah, generally speaking, you don't want to go much more than an inch deep. And I realize in a lot of areas right now, the moisture is not there right now. And you can chase that moisture probably down to an inch and a half, 2 inches. But then when you do get a rain, it takes a lot. It's a lot further distance for that moisture to meet. So I don't know. I know it's a little disheartening when you're seeding into the drier um, into the drier fields. But I've also heard a lot of older farmers say, seed in the dust, the bins will bust. So I mean, rains in May and June are what's going to make a crop. And to be honest, in a lot of our area, we'd rather see it a little bit on the drier side. But yeah, pushing it much down to 2 inches is a long way for that little canola plant to come, especially if it stays cool and we have some freezing temperatures and whatnot. Once it comes out of the ground and it finally makes it out of the ground, it's going to be kind of weak, kind of spindly, and then all of a sudden, if cutworms or flea beetles are there, and they're gonna they're gonna pounce and they're gonna jump on that canola crop and cause some more issues. So
Absolutely. And when it comes to before you're seeding too, you want to look at what sort of trash is in the field prior. Do you want to talk a bit about trash management and how that plays into it?
yeah, I mean, trash management really starts last fall. With our combine choppers and spreaders. There's lots of good technology out there, and upgrades you can make to even stock choppers on a combine. Even directing the airflow. If you're combining east and west, which in a lot of cases we're doing in a canola field, and the wind's howling out of the northwest. If you can direct your straw into that wind and have a more even distribution of straw, it can make a big deal. And most of the time in our area, canola is followed after wheat, and we can grow some pretty amazing wheat crops up in this country. 3 to 4 feet tall. There's a lot of straw there. I think down the road with new products coming to market like Modus and Manipulator, as far as PGRs go, if we can shorten that straw, if you don't really need that straw on your farm, if you're not a mixed farm, that can be beneficial as well. There's just not as much material to handle. It'll combine a little easier, and you'll be able to handle that trash a little better. And you're not going to have the lodging that can really cause issues the next year when you're trying to seed. And we run into issues like hairpinning, and frost will be worse in those areas and all those kind of things. So
Jim Hale, he's a farmer in Saskatchewan, just writes residue, not trash, with a winky face because he's probably likes the previous crop still. It's a good point, Jim. Thank you for. But anyways, so you finally get that crop into the ground. And even before you get into the ground, you're going to consider fertility. What sort of considerations, if you had a wet year or a dry year or anything like that, what sort of considerations do you want to take into mind when it comes to fertility?
yeah, I mean, just soil testing in general is, in my mind, is so very important. And I think the stats say that maybe 30% of the acres are soil tested every year. And to me, a soil test is your fuel gauge in your truck. And if you don't know what you're dealing with, it could hurt you in the end. You may not be putting on enough fertilizer on a composite level or a variable rate level. You may be putting too much on. If you're not sampling to depth, you may not see the sulfur and maybe some residual nitrogen that may have moved its way down on the profile. And if that canola crop picks that up in July and August, it may delay maturity and all those negative effects that you can have with those kind of instances coming up. You may have, based on a soil test, you may have some salinity issues, especially at depth, which may hamper your root growth of your canola, your pulses, whatever it might be, right? So I think electrical conductivity, cation exchange, what kind of soil are you dealing with? Are you more of a sandy loam or a heavy clay? And there's lots of positives and negatives of those types of soils. And just knowing your fertility and what you're dealing with. I mean, pH is another issue that I think we deal with in northern and central Alberta. We our pHs are into those mid fives, even low fives on a composite level, and it's affecting our crop growth, especially canola and pulses. And we have to start looking at maybe some liming or even some variable rate liming on a kind of a zone basis to help with some of those fertility issues, because low pH and very high pH limit nutrient availability as well. But if we're not soil testing, we don't know what we're dealing with. we're just kind of guessing, which sometimes can work out. But I think we got to be as responsible as we can with nutrient management as well. So.
And temperatures, I know when you talk corn, is canola very sensitive to different soil temperatures, or where do you want to be hitting when you're seeding?
Yeah, I mean, it's generally recommended that maybe you can start at that 5 degree, Celsius soil temperature. I'd rather see it at 8 or 10 or more. More times than not, I've seen canola, especially seeded in these cooler areas like the one that I work in. In that last week of April, first week of May, soil temperatures maybe 4 or 5, maybe less. And then, the last fields are planted, in that second, third week of May with, soil temperatures 10 to 15 degrees, and probably by the middle of June, that later seeded crop is caught up to the early seeded one, because the early seeded one just struggled to get out of the ground. It's slow growing. It may have had more flea beetle damage. I always find that the later seeded canola fields can withstand that flea beetle pressure a lot better, especially with the crucifer flea beetles that we deal with up here, generally speaking. So you can go early, but it really all depends on what happens after it's seeded as well. If you seed it and it's pretty cold, but then it warms up, yeah, you're probably going to be okay. But if it stays cool for a week or 10 days after you seed it and things stay cool and damp, that canola field's going to struggle.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of flea beetles, and we farm out here too. And there's one year that the wind came through on the little cotyledon plants, and then the flea beetles came in, and it's tough when they're that little. So obviously, flea beetles. We can talk canola without talking flea beetles. What sorts of mitigative steps can we take at this point?
Well, I think it's like most of the issues that we run into with most crops. I mean, rotation is certainly going to help, I think. Crop rotation with diseases and insect pests and all these types of things is really going to help. Like I just mentioned, I think waiting a little bit and seeding into a little warmer ground, I think is gonna help your cause a lot, quite a bit as well. But at the end of the day, we can't control the weather, and let's face it, this isn't most farmers' first rodeo when it comes to seeding canola on their farms this year. So do what works, go with your gut feeling, and what kind of things have worked in the past. But at the end of the day, trying to put as many factors in your favor that we can control is really key, because Mother Nature, we have no control over that at all. So.
So, taking a step back, I realize I'm kind of all over the map here, but another early thing we're looking at is weed control, right? Before it even gets into the ground, you're looking at what sorts of weeds might be popping up in the field, what you had last fall. What sorts of things are you going to want to keep in mind, especially when it comes to like herbicide carryover, things like that?
Yeah, I would say, some of the group 2 herbicides in particular, some of the ones that we might use in pulses in Saskatchewan and all across the prairies, we got to be cognizant of herbicide rotation as well. And if there's any potential issues with what you sprayed last year on a crop in rotation, you got to keep that, um, you got to keep that under consideration, because it may not totally kill the canola plants when they come up, but it may, depending on a rush of water or a rainfall event, it may wash them into those young roots and cause a lot of symptomology, a lot of phyto that you'll see. So really, we have to be careful with that, and make sure that we're making, we're keeping good records and keeping these things in mind for sure. As
Absolutely.
far as
And what's that?
I guess as far as herbicides and weed control as well. I mean, like most crops, we want to keep the canola fields clean as early as we can to get them off to the best start possible. So I really think that cotyledon to 4 leaf stage is a real critical time where we can do a good pre-seed or even a post-seed burn off. A lot of times we'll do that depending on how the weather is. That can be fantastic, and that in a lot of cases, depending on your weed pressure and what you're dealing with, that canola crop can get into that cotyledon 2 leaf stage with not a lot of competition around it. And then, you may consider that, that first spray in crop, or maybe it's your second spray into that, 2 to 4 leaf stage or so. And after that, the canola is going to take off and it'll start canopying in, once bolting hits, and there's not too much that's going to bother it after that. So.
And how competitive actually is, like, you talk about that critical weed free period, but how competitive is the actual canola plant when it is young?
I would say it's relatively competitive. It's not as competitive as, say, the barley that we grow and things like that. It's probably more competitive than corn, but less competitive, than most cereals, especially, in its first couple weeks of life out of the ground, for sure.
So when you're looking at the first couple weeks of life, like you're saying, what sort of diseases are you looking out for in that early season? Like, we all think later on sclerotinia, things like that, but what are the ones we're looking out for early?
Early on, from seeding to emergence, things like rhizoctonia and, sort of those seedling blight damping off complexes can really affect that, that seed as it's coming out of the ground. And, that would go back to, deep seeding. The deeper that you seed, the longer it's going to take, and more, more plant exposure that plant's going to have to the disease organisms in the soil. So, again, there's another vote probably against deep seeding, because it's just going to take that plant's going to be exposed that much longer to those potential threats. Now, luckily, I mean, all of our canola seed is treated with very good fungicidal and even insecticidal treatments. And maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But at the same time, when I've seen, probably some of the worst damping off that I've seen is usually always in the earliest seeded canola. It's just slow growing, and I just truly believe that, that seed treatment wears off quicker than maybe what we'd like to see sometimes.
So yeah, let's talk mitigative. What are some of the seed treatments that producers should be, I guess, considering, and why would somebody want to use a seed treatment if they haven't before?
Well, with canola, basically you're forced. I mean, all of the canola that comes in a bag at a retail is treated, depending on the manufacturer. They'll all have a fungicide seed treatment with various actives, that are going to help control those seedling blight damping off complexes. And then you will have the option as well to look at some insecticide. Well, they do come with insecticidal treatments as well, most of them, but for added control, for cutworms, say, and even for crucifer flea beetles, we're finding that, treatments like Lumiderm, which is probably a product you've heard of, can be really effective against both flea beetles and cutworms in areas where we tend to see them be a problem.
So we've talked flea beetles, but we haven't really talked cutworms, especially, in an area like yours where it can be cool and it can be more, there's more moisture in the soil. Do you want to talk about what those cutworms can do?
Yeah, they can be devastating, and they can kind of surprise you sometimes, I think, too. I mean, the biggest fields that are a threat in our area are any areas, or generally speaking, any areas that have more of a sandy or a sandy loam soil. Those cutworm moths in August and September, when they're laying their eggs, they prefer to lay it into soft ground, and it's easier for them to lay their eggs. And so I think, and sometimes, when we get into situations where maybe we're working the ground in the fall, even in our area here, we'll tend to find some cutworms might show up in some of those areas because the ground's a little more mellow, and the moths prefer that. But as far as the spring goes, once emergence is starting to happen in those fields, we've got to make sure that we're out there, boots on the ground, scouting not only for flea beetles but for cutworms, because they can take a lot of crop out in a few short days. And really, it's a matter of being out there and scouting, because it's if you're only looking at it every once, or every week or so, all of a sudden you can see a big bare patch out on the out on the horizon. You may not know what it is, but a lot of times cutworms can surprise us as well. They're not, other than the Lumiderm treatments and whatnot. I mean, they are kind of tough to control because they feed at night. If we do decide to spray an insecticide, it's advised usually to spray it in the late evening, early morning, or right in the dark, because that's when those cutworms are coming up closer to the surface and feeding. So they're a bit of a tricky animal to deal with, and there's certain areas that deal with them, every year or every couple of years that they grow canola, and other years, in our area, well, maybe once every 2 or 3 canola crops we'll see them. But we have to be on the lookout for them, because they can pop up and cause a lot of damage in a hurry.
And what's the initial sign of them? Like you said, if you're only going out every once a week, like we've all before seen on the top of those hills sometimes, you've seen the whole bare patch. But what's the initial kind of signs that there might be cutworms out there, short of actually seeing the
Well,
cutworms?
yeah, there's probably a couple I look for. One thing that you'll see on cotyledons or smaller plants is you'll see some notching of the leaves, as that's where the cutworms come up at night, and then they'll kind of notch and chew on the edges of the leaves and work their way into the to the growing point of the plant. A lot of times when we've seen plants get a little bigger, they'll be wilty, like they'll start to wilt, and what's happening there is they're chewing underground on the stem and the top of the root, and they're causing water translocation to just about stop, and those plants start to droop and wilt. So you'll see some of that as well. Those are some of the initial signs that I'd look for. And if you have those suspect areas in your fields or in your areas, go out there and dig and try and get ahead of them too, right? Try and find out which ones are in there. Most of the time, they're going to be red-backed or pale westerns. I know most of the time up here it's red-backed cutworms, but there's species like dingies and things like that, glassies, that you'll see from time to time in certain areas as well. So it's like I said, it's a matter of getting out there and trying to catch them early, because most of the times if you don't, you're too late a lot of times, and you might be doing some revenge spraying. That's the other thing too with cutworms. If you've maybe noticed them a little bit too late, if you do find some and they're actively feeding, how you can tell is just cut them open with your fingernail or whatever. And if there's green material inside, they're actively feeding. If there's not, they're likely either molting or they're about to pupate, and probably they're into their next life cycle, and they're probably not going to cause a whole lot more damage. So just a few things to consider there.
Absolutely. That's interesting. I've never actually heard that theory before about seeing the green inside. It makes sense for sure.
Yeah, when their bellies are full, they're lime green inside. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So if you're out now you're starting to see your crop coming up, and another important thing is plant stand establishment. You're counting through. You want to see if you actually made kind of that seeding rate. Do you want to talk about what you said about 5 to 8 plants per square meter? I believe you said.
Per square foot.
Oh yeah. So do you want to talk a bit
50 to 80 per
about
square meter for you metric people out there.
yeah? So why do we want to make sure we're doing those plant stand counts?
Well, I think it's just gonna, it's gonna kind of set your expectations for the year, and kind of, generally speaking, even plant populations down to 2 or 3 plants per square foot, you're still likely going to get a pretty good crop. There's lots of times when we've had a frost event or flea beetles or even cutworms where I think sometimes we jump the gun a little bit, and we decide to go reseeding, where the extra fuel, time, and effort to do that reseeding at the end of the day, probably, you probably could have, left it alone and still had a pretty good crop, even at 2 or 3 plants per square foot. If you have, for whatever reason, if you have a very high plant count, maybe 10 to 14, or I've seen even 20 plants per square foot, your expectation for those plants is they're going to be spindly. They're not necessarily going to branch a lot. And you're going to have to be considering a fungicide later on in July, because that plant canopy is going to be so dense, it's going to be very conducive to disease. Whereas the plants on the other side of the spectrum, those 2 or 3, they're likely going to be later in maturity, so you're going to have to prepare for that. They're going to branch like crazy. They're going to be like willow trees when you go to cut them. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, maturity is going to be different. Even weed control, you're going to really have to be on the ball with those lighter plant counts or stands, versus that the heavier plant stands will be able to compete weeds better than the others. So those kind of decisions will come into play depending on what kind of stand you've established in the field.
And Dieter says, "Good to see you, Mike. Keep up the good work." Dieter Schwartz is out in Manitoba, so he's watching right now. Always good to have you along listening as well, Dieter. So wait, I guess, well, I was gonna make a comment prior to that I've seen the photos before of agronomists out when they're out in the field, and it is seeded too heavy, and you literally are laying on top of that canopy sometimes because it is just so incredibly dense. Now, short of disease, what other sort of problems arise when it is that dense?
Yeah, I think disease is one. I mean, the insects are gonna like that nice sheltered climate as well. Definitely cabbage seed pod weevils and things like that will probably like that stand as well. But I think when it gets really thick, disease is probably our biggest worry. When it comes to that.
And I know I often, through this program, through our schools, our agronomy schools, we do too, I talk to a lot of agronomists, and it just seems like the number one rule always is getting your feet on the ground. And we can just say it over and over, but we really, really need to get in the field and actually be scouting. And one of the things they often talk about is bias. We go out to the field, you go to the same sort of area every time, or all close in the same quarter. Do you want to talk about what sorts of things you do as an agronomist that maybe some tips and tricks for producers that are trying to, really see the whole field?
Yeah, I think you just need to, sample size is always a good thing in statistics when you're trying to make a number. So, I mean, at the end of the day, look at the high spots, the low spots. I mean, there's a lot of good technology and scouting apps and things like that we can use to record what we're seeing in the field, and then we can go back to that, in future canola years or whatever we're talking about too. So, I think it's good to have an average. That you're going to have areas that are going to have higher plant stands and less than others, and maybe you adjust that either manually as you go through those areas, or maybe you've even come up with a VR seeding plan for canola or whatever it is, where you can adjust the rate. Well, the controller will adjust the rate on the fly to maybe put a few more plants into those high mortality areas, to hopefully have a little better crop at the end of the year. That's some things that you can look at when it comes to more of a zone aspect of seeding. And but yeah, at the end of the day, you got to get out there and take the highs and lows and do some averages, and managing your fields at more of a zone level. It doesn't matter if you're talking about seeding or fertility, especially. I'm a big believer in it. I've had the chance to to work a lot in that space, and I think the growers that are using their technology and their equipment to its highest potential are seeing the rewards of doing some variable rate seeding and fertility and all those kind of things to help manage the variability that's in every field. I mean, you could look across a field anywhere in Western Canada, it might be flat as a board, but I'll guarantee you there's some variability in there. So just a few things to think about there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wouldn't be canola if we didn't mention the C word. Clubroot is out there. You're in maybe not a hot spot, but territory that is definitely seen clubroot. I know lots of times, sometimes the mentality around clubroot is, oh, we don't have it here, so it won't come here. What sort of, if there was one thing about clubroot that you'd really want to be the take home message, what would it be?
Yeah, it's probably more than one. I mean, I basically do live very close to the epicenter of clubroot, and it's spread across the West, and there's various reasons for that. To just stick your head in the sand and say it's not going to hit your area, I would bet money that it very likely will. But I think there's some things as far as sanitation and whatnot that we've learned, and crop rotation that will really help. And you still have to have compliance though. We could say, every time you come out of a field that's suspect, knock all the dirt off your drill or your sprayer and make sure that you don't bring it into other fields. That's great if 9 farmers out of 10 do it, but if that one goes ripping by with mud flying off his sprayer tires, he's not really compliant. So, I think that's going to happen. And, even the, clubroot, the beast that it is, I mean, it can travel in wind currents and everything else with, with blowing dirt, even, from susceptible or with infested fields. Obviously, we've had some really wet conditions over the last probably 5 years in certain areas in this area. It's flowing through water. It's traveling with animals. It's everything. But, we do have some good resistant varieties, which I think is, helping stave it off a little bit. But, at the end of the day, Mother Nature always finds a way, and we're even seeing that with some of the best clubroot genetics in our area. They're still getting clubroot galls and they're still getting infections. So, rotation is still key. Aphanomyces and peas is something that's come into our area too. And it's kind of a similar creature where it's in the soil and it moves around quite readily, and it's devastating. There's some fields now in our area that, we probably shouldn't be growing canola there for 6 or 8 years because we've pushed our luck as far as it can go. And, we've seen some fields over the last 2 years, even with, the best clubroot genetics that, yielded 10 bushels or less because they were destroyed, and clubroot was a big part of that. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but it's just a few things to think about there. Again, with clubroot, it's not going away, and I think rotation is one of the key things that's going to help. We've talked about. I'm on the lime steering committee here in Alberta with Keith Gabert and a few other agronomists, and there's been some work with liming to to help mitigate clubroot as well. But there again, the thought of doing that is quite expensive, and when you're renting land, are you going to invest $200 or $300 an acre in rented land that you maybe lose in a couple of years? Not likely. So it's a tough animal, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's probably going to spread everywhere, and crop rotation, like most things, I think is gonna really help out, in my opinion, anyway.
And Jay Wetter is just pointing out, he's with the Canola Council. He says the Aphanomyces in Facebook subtitles is coming up as a fan of Macy's. So Facebook's trying to keep up, but it's a tough one. So thanks for pointing that out, Jay. Clubroot, if you're in an area that hasn't seen clubroot yet, are you guys recommending across the prairies that people are actually still just using clubroot resistant varieties?
Yeah, I think it's going to help, because like I said, I think if it's not there, it's likely going to be there, or maybe it's not that noticeable yet. I know in the first years, over a decade ago now, probably likely when I had an opportunity to drive around with Steven Strelkoff from the U of A, and we were looking at, trying to find clubroot in Leduc, which at that time was pretty difficult to find, but now it's no problem. You'd find blackleg, you'd find clubroot, you'd find sclerotinia, in midsummer in those same areas. But yeah, I think, especially if you're gonna be in a tight rotation, I think that, using varieties is certainly going to help in regards to, trying to help manage it anyway. But I still don't think that's a long-term solution, I guess is what I'm saying. It's potentially more of a Band-Aid than anything down the road. So I'd caution against leaning on genetic resistance too much to stop it. I just don't think Mother Nature is going to allow us to do that. We've continually seen races develop with blackleg and with clubroot as well. It can just produce so many spores. It can mutate so easily that we're not going to be able to keep up with it, I don't think, if we keep tight rotations.
Absolutely. And Jay's just commenting now. He says, good tips on clubroot mic rotation and clubroot resistant varieties are key. We should do both. So there you go. You got the Canola Council approval anyways. But I hate to leave it on the note of clubroot. We're out of time, but I don't want to leave it on that note. 2021, we're through 2020. What are you most looking forward to this year? What do you think are the things to kind of watch?
Well, I think like every other year, it's different, right? Every year is very exciting in agriculture. You don't know what's going to get thrown at us. But when I look at the fundamentals, though nearby fertilizer prices are very high right now, when I look at gross margin potential of just about anything you can think of right now, I think it's pretty fantastic. So if I'm farming, I'm really looking forward to 2021, and some of the prices that I can realize with forward contracting right now are probably record, if not higher. So it's I think things look really good. And if you're farming and if you've been farming for a long time, I mean you're tough, you're resilient. But I think that things like clubroot and some of the other diseases and insects and everything that's been thrown at us, weather, I think it usually forces you to become a better manager. And I've really seen that over the last 10 or 20 years in the farming community in general. Guys and gals are really paying more attention to what's going on and trying to learn as much as they can from their own land. And you look at a year like this, and to me, I'd be shooting for the fences. I'd be trying to knock one out of the park, because we may not see these kind of prices again in a little while. We may be. I've been wrong before about $10 canola, but things look really good right now. So I'd encourage everybody to keep your chin up and shoot for the fence in your management plan, and see where the chips may fall. But I mean, you might as well plan to win and see what happens, right?
Absolutely. And that is a much better note to leave this on, I think. So thank you very much for your time today, Mike. All the best in the 2021 growing season, and I'm sure we will talk to you again soon.
Yeah, thanks. This has been great. And I'd also like to congratulate RealAg on your renewal of your Sirius XM contract. That's a great thing. You know, Sirius is heard around the world, and you know, you guys have done a great job over the last few years bringing Canadian agriculture to the world and vice versa. So good job for me anyway, and keep it up. It's been a real joy to watch you guys work. So thanks.
Well, thank you very much. We wouldn't have a show if we didn't have listeners. So we appreciate you and everyone who tunes in. And if you don't tune in, check out Real Ag Radio every day, Monday to Friday on Sirius XM at 2:30 Mountain or 4:30 Eastern. So channel 147, Real Ag Radio. Anyways, that's my little pitch. But thanks everyone for tuning in today. If you want to tune in tomorrow to Real Ag Live, we're actually having a Real Ag coffee date. I want to say coffee date, but it's probably shouldn't be called a date when it's with your coworkers. But anyways, the RealAg team, some of our content team will be here, and we're going to be bringing you insight from stuff that happened last week, last month, and we'll probably have some fun too. So be sure to tune into that. And in the meantime, thanks everyone for getting real and getting connected.